Hey everyone, this is Julia with episode number 78 of the Mixology Talk podcast. Now, the word mixologist has a bad rap. Now, as far as I know, there is no official definition of it, but we have one of our own, and I thought maybe that would be something we could discuss today. What does it mean? Where does it come from? And why is it a really useful term for us in our industry? Well, at least according to us. And at the end of the episode, we've got a little surprise for you, something you might find interesting. So, stick around. So you're probably not surprised to hear that I did a little bit of digging before this episode to see if I could find the origin of the word mixologist. And I expected to see something about the 1980s, 1970s maybe, but I was totally wrong. The origin of the word goes all the way back to the 1800s. And if you look at cocktail guides printed in the 1890s, they frequently use the term mixologist. The earliest reference that I could find, well, based on my web research, was in 1860, where somebody explained that they had come from a bar downstairs, referring to the mixologist of titulars. So the word's really not new.
Yeah, it's one of the stories that I heard as well is just this really old school, word that has been resurrected from the past. And the person that was responsible for the resurrection is a very, very famous bartender, somebody that we can thank for the current movement that we're seeing with craft cocktails and everything, is a gentleman by the name of Dale DeGroff. And from my understanding is that he resurrected this term to kind of help distinguish the new skill set and new style of bartending for the new revolution.
This was back in the 80s, right?
Back in the 80s, back in the 70s. I can't remember when, but it's when he was in charge of the Rainbow Room in New York. And they went from using soda guns and sweet and sour mixes and, all the things that we all associate with terrible cocktails back in the 80s. He took it all the way back down to the 1800s using fresh juices and, fresh syrups and
all the concepts that we think of when we think of a craft cocktail bar.
Right. And the evolution from that, from where we were to this new style of bartending, was pretty revolutionary. You really had to figure out balance, and it was totally different from anything that we've seen in our lifetime. And so that's kind of how that word kind of came about.
It was pretty intentional on his part, too, right? I mean, my understanding is that Dale DeGroff obviously he knew about the publications back in the 1800s, because that's where this revolution came from. But in addition to that, he from what I've read, he actually chose the word.
Yeah, that's a story that I've heard as well, and I've read that in a couple of the interviews that I could find on him throughout the years. And it was very specifically chosen as a kind of a media word, a buzzword to
help distinguish this new sort of revolution of bartending.
Right, exactly. So
that being said, when we look at the last sort of 10, 15 years, things have kind of changed. I mean, this is, of course, based on our own experience, not necessarily based on research. And what I've seen bartenders who just will absolutely refuse to be called a mixologist. I've seen bartenders who are embarrassed of the term, who shun the term. And the reason is because it has this really awful negative connotation now. It's kind of taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, and the connotation that you'll see is just this kind of arrogant, self-centered person who thinks they're better than bartending. Is kind of always that vibe that you get.
And almost better than the customer.
Right, and it usually kind of takes the place of hospitality. So they're so focused on the cocktail that they're all about the drink, and they kind of lose focus of what bartending is all about. The engagement of the customers and all that stuff. So that's kind of the vibe that you're getting, and it kind of started to really balloon and almost became its own joke. It still kind of is a joke in this community.
Oh, absolutely.
And even so much so that I remember reading a article that somebody in a Ritz-Carlton referred to themselves as a guacamologist.
Oh, no.
Oh, and it just kind of, you could see the natural progression of all this stuff, right? So it has kind of this weird connotation.
I've also seen a lot of folks in the bar industry try to invent their own terms. I've seen, Darcy O'Neill calls himself a physicist.
Which is amazing.
F-I-Z-Z is the beginning of that word.
Right, and he is
he's all
trained
about
chemist.
Carbonation, too.
Right.
He's all about carbonation. And
he's amazing.
Beautiful. I've also heard, I can't remember who started this one.
Spirit Guide. I've heard Spirit Guide before.
I like that one. I've heard
good.
Coctologist.
Coctologist, yeah.
Which is well, we'll leave that there.
Right.
Dangerous. But the point being is it's a shame, I think. It's a shame that this word has gained this negative connotation. I think it's dangerous because folks have started to, again, treat the word as if it is, quote unquote, better than bartending, and they self-assign it. And so as a result, you end up with, frankly, folks who don't want anything to do with this term, even though, quite frankly, I think it's a very useful word.
I agree. I think I think it has some meaning. So I think that bartending and mixology are two different skill sets. I think that you don't need one to be the other, and I don't think one is better than the other. For me, I think that mixology is a really deep understanding of the properties of cocktails, cocktail production, a really deep understanding and studying of how to make syrups, infusions, how to use it right, flavors, balance, compatibility, like all the things that go into cocktail design, I think belong in that term, mixology.
So it's almost like the work that happens before the doors open.
Right. If you think of a fine dining restaurant, I don't even know what the number is, but I'd probably say 80% of what you get as a customer happens well before you ever open the doors, well before the customer ever walks into the building. And it's the same thing with, in my opinion, the word mixology. This is all of the infusions. This is all the barrel aging. This is all the kegs that we build with carbonating cocktails, and understanding all of the science and, you know, the flavors, what happens to flavors over time. That's mixology.
It's building the cocktail menu. It's pre-prepping ingredients. It's pre-batching cocktails. It's all of that sort of thing.
Right.
It's an incredibly important part of the process, but on its own, it's a pretty terrible bar.
Right, exactly. If that was your focus and that's the only thing you focused on, you would never have a customer. I mean, I'm sure the drinks would be fantastic,
but there's nobody to serve them.
Right, exactly. And I think that's part of that misunderstanding, in my opinion, of the word is people get fixated on it as being the same thing as bartending,
or like
better than
a really
bartending.
Good bartender.
Right.
I'm better than a bartender. I'm a mixologist.
Exactly. And I think they're very, very different skill sets. In my opinion, bartending is so much harder than building flavors and creating cocktails. It's so many different things at once.
And you've absolutely filled both of those shoes.
Right, and you can. Somebody can, you know, be downstairs prepping all their ingredients and making syrups and infusions and designing cocktail menus. But the minute you hit the floor and you face a customer, you're a bartender. All of that mixology stays downstairs or stays in a production kitchen. It doesn't really have a place on the floor, in my opinion.
To some extent, I think that those skills can be useful if you have a guest who says, you know, bartender's choice or something.
No, absolutely.
But I really do. I could not agree with you more. I think the focus, again, when you're a bartender is it is about hospitality. It's about the customer. It's not about you. It's not about being famous. It's not about how squeaky clean your handlebar mustache is. You know, it's about hospitality. But again, I think the most important thing for me here is that one is not better than the other. I think that they are so very different that it's apples and oranges.
I couldn't agree with you more. The two skills sets definitely can overlap, but they're very, very different skill sets. And you could work in a bar a lifetime and still be developing your hospitality and the way you treat customers and becoming better at it. And the same thing applies with mixology and the study of production and all that stuff. And I think that, like I said before, I think developing those skills as a bartender is so much more difficult.
So I would say, I mean, if you're looking at your career as a bartender, as a mixologist, as a person who's interested in bartending, I think that these words are both really valid. And if you're looking at how you want to grow in your career, there's nothing wrong with looking at these as different skill sets to build separately. And you can build, I think, both of them behind the bar. I mean, certainly as a bartender, I mean, there's just no better way to learn bartending than to be behind a bar.
Yeah.
You can take every course in the world, but until you've been behind a bar for 6 months, I just don't think there's anything that can replace that.
And there's a comment, or there's a stream going through Facebook right now of something around 60,000 hours, or I can't remember the number, but basically it takes 20 years to become a really skillful bartender. And I don't know if I agree with that number, but it is something. Like, I was behind the bar for probably about 15 years, and every day I learned something new, a new way of greeting a customer, a new way of speeding up service and, developing new systems behind the bar. It was always evolving. And I can see that even after 20 years of attending bar, you still begin to develop more skills behind the bar.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important. And likewise, I think that you can also find ways to build your mixology skills as well. For example, you've got, a lunch shift on a slow day and a customer comes in and doesn't know what they want to order. That's a great opportunity.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity to build a regular too.
That's true. Yeah. Exactly. You can work with them and you can actually start thinking about those flavors and build them a cocktail from scratch. And it's a great opportunity, like Chris said, to build regulars, to build your skill sets as a cocktail designer, and also to build that reputation in your own bar so you might be able to grow into that role on a more permanent basis. And if you are interested in learning the sort of mixology skill set, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of options out there. There's dozens and dozens of bartending courses that'll teach you how to, hold a cocktail shaker and make a margarita and that sort of thing. But there's just not a lot of resources for learning what we are calling mixology. For Chris, for example, you were basically self-taught, right?
Yeah, and, I struggled through it in the beginning, and it was really hard. Like, I'll have a concept for a cocktail in my head, flavor profiles and all that stuff, and when I would go to put them in a glass, it would just be absolutely terrible. And I would end up throwing bottles of booze away trying to construct a menu for a seasonal menu, and I got really frustrated over it. And so this was why I started a bar above, is because it was so difficult to take that idea and develop it into a full drink.
Exactly. And so that's why we wanted to take a minute to tell you about the mixology certification program that we've created. Basically, what it is an in-depth video course that's hosted online on our website, and it consists of 2 courses and a 2-part exam, the whole premise of which being that you can learn the stuff that you won't necessarily learn in front of a customer.
Yeah, and we've had a lot of people say that they want us to kind of go down the rabbit hole a little bit more, get a little bit more specific with some of the information behind it, and this is absolutely the perfect way to do it. We break apart everything that could possibly go into a glass down to, for example, with acids, we go all the way down to pH levels, sugar content levels, and how that all comes back into the glass in the form of a cocktail.
Right, exactly. The first course is called Understanding Cocktail Components. This one goes very in-depth into things like Chris mentioned, acids, sweeteners, spirits, etc., talking about using acid phosphate, citric acid. This is the in-depth version of the podcast, to say the least. And the second course is called Mixology 101, which is where we take everything from the cocktail components element and talk about how do you put them together in a glass in a way that works.
Yeah, and this is where the rubber really meets the road. You're taking those concepts and those really specific details of every component that goes into a glass, and you're fusing them together. Okay, so how do I substitute ingredients? How do I increase complexity and flavor? We introduce ideas like cocktail families and why they're useful, and most importantly, we've come up with a system for designing cocktails on paper well before it ever hits a glass, so that way, for me, you're not throwing away bottles and bottles of liquor, trying to develop your skills. You get the theory behind it, you start to understand the philosophy behind crafting and designing cocktails, not at the expense of the bar that you're working at.
And I will say one thing, and that is this course is really not for everybody. I would say that if you don't already have a good understanding of basic bartending skills, common cocktail recipes, especially with a focus on classic cocktail recipes, I would start with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of great resources that can tell you what a Manhattan is, what an old fashioned, what a julep is, and give you the actual recipe.
And that's actually, I think we usually recommend Bar Smarts for that, right?
Bar Smarts is a great starting point.
It's a fantastic resource. It really spends a lot of time teaching you these basics. But this program that we have put together, it's really a step in a completely different direction around that mixology skill set.
Right. And for example, I don't believe we don't teach any recipes at all.
None.
So we teach the theory behind the recipes, how all these ingredients work together and create a cocktail, and how you can take that knowledge and develop your own drinks on the fly in front of guests, develop cocktail menus, all of those things that I always found exciting. It breaks all that down. It makes it very, very, very approachable.
So hopefully we're not alone in believing that mixology and mixologist are actually useful terms for specific roles in this industry. And if you did want to focus on building these skill sets and were interested in learning more about the program that we mentioned earlier in the episode, go and head over to mixologytalk.com/certification. I believe today's episode is going to come out on July 20th, 2016. If you go over there and use the coupon code MIXOLOGYTALK without any spaces, before the next episode comes out on August 3rd, we'll go ahead and give you 50% off as a little token of our appreciation for the other cocktail nerds out there. So again, if you're interested, it's mixologytalk.com/certification. And of course, you can always check out the show notes at mixologytalk.com/78. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you on the other side of the bar. Cheers.
Never miss an episode by subscribing in iTunes or YouTube. And as always, check out the show notes by clicking on the right.